Okay, so as we know, a Miraculous Ladybug movie titled Ladybug Cat Noir, the movie, was released last year and told an abridged version of parts of Season 1 through Season 5 of Miraculous Ladybug, focusing largely on the growing relationship between Adrien and Marinette, and also that of Ladybug and Cat Noir, their alter egos. On top of that, it dealt with the rise of Gabe as Hawkmoth, his reign of terror, and then his eventual change of heart when he discovers who Cat Noir truly is, and thus his defeat, and even at the end, I'm pretty sure that Gabe turns himself in, so maybe he goes to jail. But regardless, the film did a lot of stuff that was different from the show, and for a condensed version, I thought it was pretty good. I enjoyed myself. Parts was spotty, but I had fun, especially since it was on Netflix, so I didn't even have to pay for it. But yeah, I'm not really sure the world at large necessarily agreed with me. A quick look at Rotten Tomatoes said that critics' aggregate approval sits at 50%, but that's off 14 reviews, which is not many. And honestly, anyway, when it comes to these sorts of films, I do take the opinions of critics with a bit of a grain of salt, as I don't really think many critics are capable of looking at these sorts of films and judging them for what they are and what they set out to accomplish, rather than what they think a movie should be. They often use a one-size-fits-all approach, which clearly does not work here. But hey, the audience score, it's much more favourable, a 76% aggregate score, so to me it seems like if you're a fan of the show already, decent chance you'd enjoy it. I mean, I enjoy the movie. It's not anything special, but I did enjoy it. So I think from that perspective, from a fan perspective, it did well. In terms of its financials, I honestly don't know how it did. It had a budget of $86 million, but the wiki page says it only made $39 million at the box office, which at first glance really does look like a flop of colossal proportions. It was apparently a financial disappointment at the French box office, which would be a big hit considering it's a French show, but it did well in Germany and Russia. But the reality is Netflix bought the international distribution rights for most countries. So you'd have to assume that they made their money back through that payment. As in, Zag & Co. made their money back. The financial investors made their money back. The movie was profitable. Because I assume that the movie did well on Netflix. And so yeah, I think there's every chance it comes back for a sequel. It does seem like a bit of a passion project for Zag anyway, so I think he'd want to push for more, but I guess we'll just all wait and see. But regardless, we have a lot of questions surrounding a potential future installment. What does it look like? Who's the villain? What's the story there? What from the previous version, i.e. the show, should be included after all? Like I said, this was an extremely abridged version, and thus, there's been a whole heap of cuts. The main thing we saw was Marinette and Adrien sort of starting a romantic relationship, and we have Hawkmoth already defeated and potentially in prison. It's unclear, but he's still alive, and that's a massive change. Whilst Natalie seems to be gearing up to become Mayura and continue the quest to try to bring Emily back to life due to her own friendship with her. But I gotta say, whilst we often clown on the show for not really having much development, and the development it does get being snail-paced, there's still a whole heap of stuff that was left out of the film. There just wasn't time. And so there's a whole heap of stuff that theoretically could make the cut of the second one. But realistically, we need to figure out what's the most important to include first up. What are the more crucial elements that a second Miraculous film has to include in order to push forward the overall narrative, remain fresh, and avoid the story and characters becoming stagnant and stale? And so I guess that's what the remainder of the video is going to be about, trying to puzzle together what elements fit together best to end up with a top tier sequel that would satisfy fans and make the studio some actual money. For starters, we're talking villains, Mayura. So this is Natalie as the main villain. No Butterfly Miraculous this time, I think, just the Peacock. So only Sentimonsters, which adds some variety. And so now we have two options. Either they keep Natalie around as a villain beyond this, which feels unlikely. I feel like if anyone's going to be a two-movie villain, it was Gabe, not Natalie. Or they're going to kick her to the curb like they did with Gabe. That's the way. Wrap up each villain in a single film in case they don't get another movie due to it being a bomb or whatever. And then maybe chuck some hints as to the future. And so with that being said, I don't see how they could possibly have time in the second film at all to dive into any of the Sentimonster stuff, as in Adrien, Felix, Kagami being Sentimonsters. Because you have to introduce those fresh characters, etc., explain the sequence of events. Gabe's not around for this one, you'd expect. It's just way too much. Instead, I think they got to take a page out of the show's book here. They got to slow things down because the films just can't hold that much. They don't have the runtime that's needed. So you have to prioritize. And here's how. So one of the key elements that surrounded the debut of Mayura in the show was the events of Heroes Day. That's where Paris was celebrating Ladybug and Cat Noir, but also at the same time, Carapace, Rena Rouge, and Queen Bee. So you take that and then try to remember which characters, which side characters, the first movie spotlighted the most in terms of students outside of Marinette and Adrien. Well, it's got to be Alia, Chloe, and Nino. I mean, Sabrina was there too, but not as much. That's your big three. The big three in the show, the big three in the movies. You add them to the major heroes, you got your big five. During the course of season 2, they seemed primed to become permanent side heroes for the main pair. Hell, those Miraculouses were in the top layer of the box. They were the most important straight up. And so I think that's likely the big direction the second film's going to take, introducing some new heroes. And Chloe, to help fight against the Senti monsters that our heroes are going to come up against, as well as adding some new powers for some variety. Because this lets us further explore those friendship dynamics, as well as the antagonistic dynamic that exists between Marinette and Chloe, but also that Stan relationship that exists between Ladybug and Chloe. It feels like a really interesting way to further explore the world and flesh out these new versions of the characters, whilst also preventing your main pairing, Adrien and Marinette, growing stale through only following them, only focusing on their interactions with one another. And in that vein, this leads me to think about Chloe. She was pretty bad in the movie, but far more of a generic mean girl that we knew from the early days of the show. So far, the movie does seem unafraid to change major pieces of the storyline to suit its needs. Look at Gabe. So perhaps, since it's one of the more controversial storylines in the history of the show's run, they might end up following through on that Chloe redemption / anti-hero arc instead of having her go full villain. A lot of the characters and their personalities and their backstories were slightly, but noticeably, tweaked. So I think it could work if written well. And really, in the end, that's what we're here for. The characters and their interactions. We saw it in the first film. We'll see it in the show. And ultimately, I like changes because, if you want to see the OG, watch the show. I want a fresh take here. And really, I'm living for the drama and for the character development. The fighting sequences, the action, that's a lesser focus. That's very clear if you watch the show. The action's kind of just there, at least for the first 4 seasons. Season 5 did step it up. It's more about how the characters deal with the hand they've been dealt that matters. And so up in the ante, more characters, more dynamics to juggle. That's the best move, I think. Makes the world feel more robust. On top of that, though, they need to focus more on Natalie. For the main villain in the movie, Gabe was just not given enough time to develop at all. Let this man cook. And so it's so much harder to care about him in the movie and what he's going through, even though he's way more sympathetic. And it was much harder to care about his relationship with Adrien since they shared like 1 or 2 scenes. It was kind of ridiculous. And so I think they really need to find some time to dedicate to her, to flesh her out as a character. You got to flesh out her motives, her dynamic with Adrien, her dynamic with Gabe, and with Emily. Otherwise, the ending is going to fall flat and feel incomplete, like it did for Gabe in the first movie. So, yeah, I really think that's how it should and will play out. The first film, it served as that introduction to the world, meeting the characters, introducing the concept. But next up, you've got to flesh it out more. You've got to dive deeper into the characters that we know before you meet the new faces and characters. Otherwise, everything gets bloated and you achieve nothing. You need to flesh out those minor heroes first. Then you can start doing Felix and Lila. You can still meet them this movie. You should introduce them because you do need a new villain setup for the third film if you make one. But ultimately, you need to focus on the big 5 heroes. And then Natalie as well. That's who the focus should be on for this movie, and then they can readjust. And so, with all that being said, that's the end of the video. And these have just been my opinions, and I'd like to hear yours. What do you think of my ideas? Do you like them, hate them? Am I an idiot? I'm honestly curious to hear what you have to say, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.